First question I would have would be about your approach to materials, and I wanted to start with a thought that was expressed to me once by the artist Terry Winters, in which he described drawing as a haptic environment, which, in other words, an environment of touch, which seems to me to relate to materiality. And I know that you're someone who uses materials sometimes in an exploratory way, but also in a way that is a way that you derive content out of your work. So why don't you talk about maybe your approach to materials in general, and then we can talk about specifically how it relates to this series.
Okay. Well, I always think that the choice of material determines the direction that the work will go in, and that there are certain materials which are very compelling. The reason that I work with pigments, when there's so many astounding paints available in tubes, is that the pigments give you a nuance and a range that we don't otherwise have, that you couldn't possibly get. You can make a much more transparent surface by using pigments than you ever could from squeezing out a tube of paint like toothpaste. These particular drawings are made with peach black, soot, and the reason that I used peach black is because of all the blacks, it is the most absent and the softest, and it seemed to me to be an appropriate metaphor for the subject. You can make, I think that people are very limited I guess some people view paints as what you use to make what you're going to use. Mm-hmm. But to me, the individual characteristics can open up a world of possibilities. I mean, actually, black can be made out, there can be grape black from grape seeds, there can be cherry black from cherry pits. There is iron oxide black.
I had never heard of pêche de noir, as you said. How did you discover this wonderful sounding material?
Well,
it's so interesting.
I discovered it once in a tiny handmade paper company, a paint company that was actually, I think, a remnant of Impressionist times in Paris, and I discovered peach black, which I thought, pêche de noir, which I thought, what a great name for a racehorse. But since I wasn't buying racehorses, I bought it, and I loved it. And I have never seen peach black made. I've never seen another tube of peach black. It's simply not on the radar, even like small handmade. And I thought when I started this series, let me see if I can find it. Let me see if it exists still. And I did. But it's a very, very soft black. I mean, ivory black is another very
So
common
you could say it's a type of charcoal because it's a type of burned material in a sense, or is it...
Charcoal is charcoal.
Yeah. So
it's not charcoal.
Yeah.
It's soot.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, charcoal can be beech wood, or
right.
I mean, you can make black out of cuttlefish bladder.
Right.
And I think that all of these things are incredibly interesting to me and tempting. What is it like? Why is cuttlefish bladder different than something else? And how can I not find out?
So starting with that material, did that lead to the beginning of this series in particular? Or?
No. I think I just had this idea of the drawing on the series, the graphite, is almost like a rubbing. Mm-hmm. And I felt that the drawings, the process of doing them was almost like doing rubbings, where they emerge from the surface and where you have something and you don't know what you have until you rub it. And that process really intrigued me. Mm-hmm. And I took a small bit of paper that happened to be lying around, and I tried it out.
Which was this scale?
This scale. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, this is a good scale. It seemed right. So I kept on going with it, and only after I got a few of them done did I take a look on the wall, and I thought, oh, these are memorial drawings. But
the scale gives them an intimacy that your work doesn't always have, and your paintings can often be large and expansive, even if they're small. They can have a monumentality. Of course, these were produced in certain circumstances after your husband's death. You said that you realized they were a memorial once you started working on them.
yes,
But I was very struck the first time I saw them by the fact that they were a shift down in scale, and there was an intimacy. So why don't you talk about them as a kind of meditation or memorial?
you know, I think it was the poet Marion Moore who said that the best cure for loneliness is solitude.
Which is a
And
great
as I was working with this, they started out as memorial drawings, but they quickly, I don't mean that Mitch isn't in them. I feel like just as my work is about transparency, Mitch is a layer in me that's there. But they became less about tearing my hair out and more about finding my center and more about finding balance and realizing what I had learned from Mitch, had taken from him that was now in me, and I think that someone said the other night, Patty said, that she found it an optimistic show, and I love that comment because I feel like they're not pessimistic. I mean, I am an optimist.
Right, yes.
And I feel as if what I take is gratitude. It's not, it's gratitude, and in so doing, it is an accumulation. And these drawings are constructed in a cumulative way.
Black as a color is obviously associated with mourning and death, but it's also the color of drawing, and it's the color of typography, and it's the color of, it has many associations, and it's also, it's not technically a color, I suppose, but you can think of it, one can think of it as a color, and it allows an infinite range of course it goes into grays and whites and an infinite tonal gradation, and it allows for a kind of very subtle exploration of form and shifting, and so you're a painter too. You're very aware of color, but your drawings often do something very different, I find.
They do, you know, and I love drawing because I think that it's a very spontaneous. You get the artist's first reaction, and then being who I am, I tend to go over it and rework it, and but that's part of a gratifying process to me.
Do you make drawings for your paintings when you
Never.
That's what I
Never.
thought. I didn't think you
Never.
did.
They're totally different, and they
yeah.
perform a different. They perform a different.
Well, you always think of your drawings as I mean, they're always finished
embodied.
work.
They're always independent bodies.
Right.
And again, I think that's because I respond to mediums. The idea of translating a drawing into a painting is sort of is a very tedious one.
Talk about selecting. I'm sure selecting is the materials that you use is probably some. I imagine, correct me, some form of selecting and some form of discovery, and it's probably like a little aspect of both.
Totally. And there's usually a problem involved. I mean, I think for the smoke, the problem was.
That's interesting because Abby has these amazing smoke drawings that is obviously a very experimental, unusual material to use, although not totally unprecedented. But
well, the way that it seemed to me to be interesting to use smoke drawings is if you could find some way to control the smoke, and not to bully the smoke, but to diagnostically capture the smoke on paper and capture the natural movements And I think the natural movements in these things too give me great pleasure to discover. When I speak of them as rubbings, it's the same kind of it's how can I freeze? How can I highlight what has already happened so that instead of just becoming transient, instead of our forgetting and it's blurring out, it's there and it remains stable. And that's an interesting idea to me.
Like the smoke drawings, these drawings have both chance and extreme control
Totally.
in them.
And
Yeah.
I started to work. The first work that I ever did was watercolor. And I think that the choice of watercolor, the first, beyond crayons and coloring books and whatever, but watercolor is a very good medium for me. And because it's transparent, and because it's like sort of walking on a tightrope to do. Whatever you do, you're stuck with. But it's also cumulative. And the way I did it, I could like go back and rework and heighten, and it was and I think the idea of transparency and layering has been, it's in all my paintings. And I think it's related to the way I see things. I mean, I was very, very myopic, and I sort of don't have depth perception. So whatever I work on, it makes more sense to me to parse it in terms of layers. When I see something,
Parse is a good word. Yeah.
I have to kind of infer where it is in space, because it's not evident. I can only guess exactly where it might be.
I get the sense from looking at, especially this body of work, that there is a sense of looking very, very closely at a very small area.
Absolutely.
And trying to come to terms with that. What about working serially? These were you conscious? Did these become a series after you started them? I mean, I think of you working serially all the time.
I do work serially.
Yeah.
Because if I find something that interests me, then I keep on going with it. And then when I feel as if I've come to the end of the natural evolution, I don't want to repeat.
I imagine there's always a learning curve to some degree.
Always.
You figure it out, and then you've mastered it, and then you keep going for a little
Usually
while.
what happens is I figure it out. I mean, I'm on the way to figuring it out. Then it becomes a little more, instead of making it simpler and taking a shortcut, I make it more complicated. And then I try to reduce it to the simpler essence again.
How did you make these more complicated when you were working on them?
By reworking them, first of all, one of the things that's terrific about doing these drawings is that sometimes they get messed up. And when they get messed up, it's absolutely, you have to, just like with watercolor, you have to figure out, Rita? Okay. You have to figure out how you're going to deal with the unexpected. And sometimes you don't do it well. But other times, because something happens accidentally, you incorporate it and you discover something that you wouldn't have.
Do you throw a lot out, in general?
Not a lot from these, but from the smoke, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think these are more digestible in terms of the process. And there are others that I put up, and then after I see them for a bit, they're not as satisfying, so I might take them down. And others that, when I look at them, they grow on me, and it makes me want to go further with the idea.
I think I said to you that when I first saw these that I thought they had a musical quality. And
I love that association.
And I think drawings, in the history of drawing, one can pick out a history of drawings as scores almost. There's a whole way in which in some cases it's artists like John Cage who are literally using them as scores. In some cases it's choreographers who find out, it's a good way to work out their ideas, and to record something on paper that is working spatially. But sometimes it's more of like a visual kind of progression, syncopation.
Right.
And that's how I saw these, because they're, it's a theme is picked up, it's repeated somewhere else. Obviously, you grew up in a musical household, or not grew up. You lived in a musical household.
I lived in a musical house by osmosis. Osmosis.
There's musical talent in your household,
right.
even if it's not from you.
I would say I grew up in a visual household, right. But the musical thing is completely. I was a sponge for the musicality that I got from my husband and my kids.
Were you aware of that at all as you were working on these? Did you feel like these had any kind of musical aspect to them?
I was thinking of Mitch, but you were the first one. You came over to see them quite early on, and you said, "Oh, these are musical." Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
You said they were musical, and I thought, wow, that's a good comment, and I know exactly what you mean. That there's a conversation between them, and that a syncopation is a very good analogy.
And you said you like to close things out. I mean, have you finished with this? Or
nope, still going.
Yeah.
My studio has a dozen more, and I'm not at that stage yet. I mean, you don't know till you are. But right now, I'm still finding it a productive and gratifying. I thought of doing, Mitch died at 86, so I thought, oh, maybe I'll do 86. But now I'm thinking, maybe not. So, I mean, you can't just stretch it to...
You'll know when you're done.
Yeah, sure. I'll know when I'm done. I'll know when I'm done.
There's something of weights and balances in these works, and there's something about the interaction of the support and the medium. Maybe you could talk about how that helped create the form. It's very apparent when you look at them. The form and the medium. The form meaning the surface. Shape. Well, I'm thinking about the interaction between the surface and the medium, and how that helped you get to what you were getting to.
Yes, I think that when I built it up, when I built up the surfaces, some of the surfaces are pretty smooth, and
is the paper fairly smooth?
The paper is fairly smooth.
And
I used to love Arches paper, but Arches paper, the one that I loved for watercolor, is bumpy. It's rough, and I love that. Nonetheless, when you finish with Arches paper, the paper becomes a little gray when it's photographed and looked at, because of the multitude of shadows that all the bumps create.
Interesting, yeah.
So I thought this had to be, I wanted a hard surface, I wanted a clean surface, and I wanted a reactive, I wanted a sharp contrast between what wasn't the drawing and what was. And
well,
so
you got that for sure.
The only choice was, this paper is Italian, it's Fabriano extra white, heavy. But the idea, the reason that I looked for the whitest paper that I could.
And do you size it? Do you do anything to prepare it?
I didn't size it. The peach pit soot is mixed with rabbit skin glue. And so that was the basis for the blacks.
And what about graphite?
The graphite is in a bar, in a stick rather, more like a stick. And the graphite I like really, really soft. The thing about graphite is, at least the way I use it, is that the harder you press, the more the graphite floats above the surface. And I really like that. I mean, most things, if you press hard, it goes deeper in. But this thing, you press hard and it separates.
Interesting.
And I don't know why that is. I mean, and that was the other, the drawing series that I did before, that I showed in San Francisco, that was also the basis. The realizing that the graphite stays on a different plane then at that point I use charcoal. That it's never on the same plane. And that's what made me think that it might be an interesting thing to explore.
Graphite really is unlike any other medium. You think of some people like artists like Ang, who were able to use it in this incredibly delicate way, and it must be that the fact that he could get this detail down to what seemed like eyelashes, and working on an incredibly almost miniature like way. No way you could do that with charcoal. No way you can't get the kind of precision. But there's also almost a liquid quality to it. It gets a sheen. You can tell graphite right away if you're trying to identify medium by looking at it in raking light, and it picks up light and shines it back at you.
But Ankle probably used a very, very hard pencil.
Probably, at a really sharp point.
Like 9H, what they call now. The hardest possible pencil to do that.
But you used graphite as
Let me turn the tables, Carter. Let me ask you about why paper? What made you intrigued with it?
Definitely the intimacy and the directness. There's an absolute the fact that you can, if you study art history and you study the history of art, you can pick it up. If you're a curator, you're in a museum, you can pick it up and look at it, and the relationship that you have to a drawing, if you're studying the history of drawing, is a bodily. It's like this. It's not like a painting on a wall. It's usually flat on a table, and there's some different connection there. I think it's the same reason it is the nascence of an idea often. It's that you experience it that way even as a viewer, as a certain type of viewer, as someone who studies the medium. I think that's true, and that's why these are. When I mentioned scale, I mean these are drawing scale, and there's a concentration in them that comes from that scale to me that wouldn't be possible it's not possible in painting in the same way, even in small scale painting. I have to ask one question, just because art historically, Barnett Newman comes to mind, the Stations of the Cross. Those are paintings, but they're paintings with a strong drawing quality. But they also just the weights and balances. There's some formal similarities. Were you thinking about that at all?
I wasn't,
do you care?
But Fong asked that. Yes, I do. I like that.
Yeah.
Here's a bit of trivia. Barnett Newman was buried next to Mitch's parents in the cemetery.
Oh my God,
and
that's
I remember
amazing. That's crazy.
I know, the adjacent tombstone, so I went out with Mitch to the cemetery. I said, oh, Barnett Newman is here.
Oh my God.
He said, what? I said, look, you never told me Barnett Newman was right next to Rebecca and David here,
wow.
Mitch's parents. But, so maybe on a certain very subliminal way. But I mean, I think black. Oh, okay, so my microphone. I think that black is something that I wanted to get around to. That there is something very compelling about black, and that I think I was attracted to the idea of rubbing and rubbing and rubbing is a gratifying process, especially when it's not just, especially when you affect the result, because some things, for example, if you go over paint, all you get is more three-dimensional paint. If it's a tube of paint. But with graphite, the surfaces are, the layers are so minuscule that you have the opportunity to build it up in a very different way.
Yet it continues to float and doesn't get necessarily denser.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So these are a combination of this pêche de noir and graphite and
the glue.
And the glue. Yeah, I did. Yeah, and how did it? But you're not mixing them up in some pot.
No.
They're all
the glue. Wait, the glue and the pigment get mixed.
Yeah. Okay.
However, the peach black in the pigment tends to, in a lot of them. Sometimes I work it. In a couple of these drawings, the peach black and glue was wet, and I worked it into the wet. Most of them had surfaces that were dry, and then I worked the graphite. But I wanted to see what happened, and for that, I used graphite in a powdered form to do that. But generally, they were isolated, the layers were isolated from one another, or certainly the black layer, and that it was never mixed.
Did your experiences working here at Dieudonné with paper help you understand paper as a part of the medium in a different way?
Totally. I mean, this place, for anybody who doesn't know it, is an absolutely extraordinary place. It is the only place on earth that artists can actually collaborate with paper makers, and they can do whatever they want. And the fact that a number of, a lot of the artists who work here have exhibited within the last 5 years major museum retrospectives in our New York museums. And when I came into Dieudonné the first time, and I saw rows of galoshes. They have these rows of galoshes because it's a very wet process. And as you begin to make paper, you find the size that best suits your foot, and you clomp around the studio in these galoshes all day. There was just something very, very different about it from printmaking. It has almost an archaic, simple. You drain the paper, you watch the water drip, you're working in a mold, you press it. Sue told me, now we'll put things in the drying machine. And what she meant by the drying machine was a stack of old sort of rags of I don't know what, an absorbent, followed by plywood planks. This was the machine. And I, just as I like archaic medicine and things before they figured it all out, there was something very seductive about this. And it also opened my mind to the possibilities of what could be done with paper. I've done a lot of work here. This I did in my studio, but I was lucky enough, I made a book with Sue, with Dieudonné Press, and I've done a number of projects. And it opened my mind up to what paper could do and what it was.
I think people that maybe just aren't specialists in drawing or the history of art just don't realize that the history of drawing and printmaking too is the history of paper, and paper is incredibly, it's like black, it's incredibly subtle, the texture is incredibly important. Seurat found a way to draw without line because he found a way to use the paper and the texture of the paper, and that goes for almost every artist who works in drawing in a subtle way, and so it is really fascinating. It's interesting you mentioned the book. We have this beautiful book in the Whitney collection that I just love. That is also like it's a serialized idea.
And in the book, I made the book by taking it was actually a lithographic powder, and in many of the drawings I dispelled it in a repellent, and then tilted the paper around, fooled with the idea of the repellent. First of all, you put it in something to spread the liquid, and then you put a repellent into it. And that was again, there's a certain observation of the natural process.
It's scientific almost. It's like
but baby science. More like chemistry room explosions. More than the idea of the computer. The idea of the calculations on the computer has less allure than the experimentation.
But some artists wouldn't want to get bogged down in that, whereas that actually is what you thrive on.
I love it.
I find that interesting. Because it's a kind of there's an instinctive something going on.
It's also a manual labor.
Yeah.
Which is much more gratifying to me than something where you're many steps removed.
You don't always work abstractly. Sometimes you work with image. Sometimes you work with text and create an image or a form that goes with that text. Do you consider and you've done image-based things here at Dieudonné, and also you've done a series of paintings that's image-based. Do you consider them separate bodies of work? How do they influence one another? Are they?
I feel like when I started to work, because I was so nearsighted, the idea of painting something abstract was just like, there's too many variables here. I have to get some variables out. And so it seemed logical to concentrate on something very small that I could see. And that was, fruits, vegetables. And then I realized that this concentration on the fruits and vegetables was put me into a tradition that I didn't feel a part of. It put me into a botanical tradition that, which was not where I wanted to be. And so I thought to myself, well, what would happen if I can't paint something that's too distant because I can't see it. So what would happen if I took something very small and I made it very big? And since this was watercolor, it was hard to do like 40 by 60 radishes because they have to be painted flat or the water's going to run. So I think that then as I got more confident and as I got to know the materials better, I felt that I could never do something, okay, now I'm going to think of circles. It has to be a stimulus from life. It has to hang on something, so that, for example, the paintings that I'm doing now are a series of subway paintings. And
with text?
With text.
From the paper?
Yeah, and I did a series of maps also that had text in them. And I like working with text, but I do my best to edit out. The phrases in the text are ambiguous. I don't want to proselytize. I don't want to. These paintings do not take a stand in terms of, they're not didactic. They're merely, it's more the irony of language and the randomness of placement that we all have living in the city. I mean, you live in New York City and you're constantly exposed to random events. And
other people's conversations.
Exactly. Bits of paper on the street, signs that you see, bricks that are chipped away on a building, taxis that have an interesting scratch on them. I mean, you're just assaulted.
But the natural world's also quite important.
Very important.
For those of you who've been to Abby's studio, she has a little Wunderkammer that has a collection of all kinds of objects. It feels like a little bit 19th century. Talk about the things you collect and why.
Usually, my collection, nothing is super valuable. I think of it as things that just interest me. I have a wonderful collection of eyes that I bought long before I was even working seriously. But they were so mesmerizing. They're made of porcelain and they're hand painted. And the first set was from Dublin, and they went around the countryside, and anyone who needed an eye, they'd just give them their choice, and then the person would stick in the eye. But the beauty of the eyes.
It's an interesting thing for an artist to choose too.
Yeah, and first I thought, when I started to work, I thought, oh, maybe I'll do something with these. And then I looked at them, are you nuts? This is it. This is already what it is. And you can't do anything to it that won't make it less than what it is. But there was something about, and that was, for me at the time, very expensive. I thought, why am I spending all this money for something completely useless? And I thought, because I'll never see it again, and because I'll regret it for years if I don't. But I think what intrigued me about it was, here you have a series of ostensibly identical forms. I mean, every eye has the same every eye is an eye and works within not identical forms, but works within a given set of specifications to be a human eye. And yet the incredible variation between them was very compelling to me. And also the detailing, the fact that some of the eyes had veins that had been painted, and the veins they had probably been painted with a single squirrel hair. That's how thin the veins were. I mean, so delicate.
Yeah.
And
where does one body of work usually lead to the next? And do you know what after you finish these, do you have some idea where you're going to go, or is it?
I often have an idea, but it very often doesn't. You know, you have an idea, you start playing with the idea. Sometimes it leads to the next. For example, the cityscapes that I was doing have naturally led to the subway and the text. And that was a pretty seamless transition. But when I finished the series that's environmental, that you have one in your living room.
I do, yeah.
When I finished the series that was it was called Undertow, I thought, well, that's it. That's not a direction that I'll go in. These were very interesting, and yet what I got out of it, what I learned from it, is that it wasn't a direction that I'd go again, but it enabled me to go back to my more abstract painting with a more concrete idea of what it was that I was going to do with it, so that I approached the abstract work differently after that.
In the history of art, not necessarily abstract painting, although it could be that, do you have heroes? And
do you
have heroes? And
everybody has heroes. In abstract painting or in the history of art?
Just in general, I always like
Okay, Piero della Francesca. And that's the first one that comes to mind.
Interesting. Well, maybe that's
Giotto. I mean, I think the colors of Giotto, there's been nobody else like him. The other people, everybody, Bacon. These are all people who have, I don't emulate them.
Right.
But I just find myself riveted by them and in awe of them. I really like medieval painting on panels.
I think awe is a good way of inspiring.
Yes.
It's okay to be in awe because it makes you
How about you?
work a little
Let me
harder.
turn the tables.
I always say Michelangelo. I don't know why, just my favorite. I had experiences with his work when I was young and still like forming my ideas about art history, and I just like, I really was in awe. And I think my most favorite work of art is this piece in Milan, this piece that's done finished in the Castello Sforza, the Rondanini Pietà, which looks like a Brancusi from some angles. It's an incredible piece.
Wow. That
may be my favorite work of art ever. And his drawings are just like completely unbelievable. I don't know how people get that one. So that's I mean, it's sort of an obvious one, I suppose. But,
well, I think that if you just seek out to choose the obscure, you
can name plenty obscure, but
right. I want to thank Carter. I know Sue did before, but to come when the Whitney is like on the cusp here is really incredible. And I also want to thank Sue and Jack for making this available to me and for being as terrific as they've been, and all of you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.